Book of Acts. When I started looking at this, I didn't know I was going to wind up where I did, but I've had more requests for doing a study on this. Unfortunately, I think it's because we associate the Book of Acts with the beginning of the growth of the church. We don't look at it as a continuation. In other words, we're looking at this to see if we can find those things, those items that will cause our church to grow. We're looking for the keys, in other words. And I think this is a mistake that we make, because if we're looking for keys here, we're ignoring the whole first start of the book. But we'll get into that a little bit more. What I want to do is I want to go into the Book of Acts and treat it like a timeline. Give you the same thing that I did with the first 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, and what I also did with the prophets, where Samuel the kings are the timeline for all of the prophets. So the Book of Acts is a timeline for everything that the Apostle Paul wrote. We should be able to see all the books that he wrote somewhere in here. Okay, so I want to approach it that way to see if maybe I can clarify some misconceptions that we may have. So this is very, how should I say, very nerdy, it's a lot of information that doesn't seem like it makes a difference until you put it all together and then you're able to see the picture. In the same way that I would take volumes and volumes of end of the month reports and compile them into 1 or 2 or 3 charts in order to show the company in a very clear and graphical way what the story was. So we're going to look at it in this way. Okay, so whether you believe it was in 30 AD, 33 AD, 36 AD, or whatever AD that you think, however it was that you were taught, my understanding comes from I read a report on a Christian Jew that had gone back, and what they did is by using the NASA website, by looking at the feast of the Passion Week, the Feast of Passover, the Passion Week, the last week where Jesus was the Passover, and looking at those days, they went using the NASA website to look for a time where those days would fit in, and they came up with 30 AD. So the Roman Catholic Church will tell you 33, 36, or 37 AD in order to create their own narrative. So I'm just using 30 all the way to 70. Everybody agrees that in 70 AD the temple was destroyed. So we're going basically 40 years is really what we're talking about. So now chapter 1 starts after the tomb or after the resurrection, and then we have 50 days until Pentecost. He's with them for 40 days, and then the next 10 days he tells them go to Jerusalem and wait there and until you receive power. Okay, so the first question that I have for you, chapter 2 starts with the day of Pentecost. If Jesus fulfilled all the feasts and everything from the Old Testament at the cross, why are we counting 50 days to Pentecost in the Book of Acts, and why does the Book of Acts start with Pentecost? If another thing has to be fulfilled in order for walking down the feast of the Lord, in essence. Okay, so that's the first question that I have for you. But anyway, chapter 2 it starts with Pentecost, and then I'm just going to give you some highlights of everything that is there. But I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the with the prophets and with the kings. These are the Roman kings that we know historically aligned themselves. So this is how the scholars are able to tell more or less when something happened. When the name is mentioned, when a king is mentioned, then we know that it must have been during that time. We could be off 3 or 4 or 5 years, but still we know that it's within the time. So we have the Roman kings that will be mentioned in the New Testament. You will have the rulers, the Jewish rulers. Those kings would then appoint rulers over the Jewish people, and then you would have the provincial rulers, what are called the consuls, the proconsuls, the ones that were ruling certain sections at the time, or they were responsible of those that are mentioned. Okay, so that's the first thing. This is the way that we can kind of put the book chapters in order. So history will show you. I didn't do this first. I went and did and put the chapters in their order, and then I added this later, and then adjusted the chapters accordingly. So we're going to start at the day of Pentecost. Actually, again, the cross and resurrection, 50 days afterwards, or the counting of 7 Sabbaths. 7 times 7 is 49. The next day, which would be 50, or always on a Sunday, would be on the first day of the week, would be the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost is, I realize that some of you will have difficulty understanding this, but it was the first day of the work week, where one could actually go and gather and bring the sheaves, or the first fruits of the at the end, or at the end of the spring harvest, or at the beginning of the summer harvest, which is around May or June. But it had to be a work day, or Sunday, or Yom Rishon, the first of the week, the first day of the week. And so this is on that day where they were actually coming to the temple in order to be able to give of their first fruits. Okay, so then somewhere around chapter 8, you have Stephen's death, and then you have chapter 10 is Peter and Cornelius. Chapter 12, you have the death of James, but it's kind of hidden because it says it was during the days of the Feast of Unleavened Breads, where Peter was taken captives, and when the ruler killed James, and he saw that it pleased the people, he went and got Peter in order to kill him after the Feast of the Passover, or the Feast of the Unleavened Breads, which is 7 days after Passover. So then, so this is significant. James is killed, and then Peter is made captive because of the reaction of the people to the death of James. And I would say the people, not the people in general, but basically the scribes and the priests, the rulers at the time. So chapter 12 is when Peter's taken captive. And then we have the first missionary journey in around chapter 13, the second journey around chapter 16, and then the third missionary journey. And then he's winding it down. The Apostle Paul is winding it down because he needs to be to Jerusalem by a certain feast that is there. So he wants to be at the temple in Jerusalem. So from 18 to 22 is the winding down of that, or his trip coming back to Jerusalem for a feast. Why would he be coming for a feast if Christ the cross fulfilled all of the feasts? Okay, and then the last at Jerusalem, he's at the temple, and he's taken captive. The Roman guards basically get him so that he's not killed by the people there. So in essence, they're protecting him. And then he claims to be a citizen of Rome, and then so therefore he has to be taken to Rome in order to be judged. So from the last chapters of the book of Acts is where he retells his testimony before Felix, before Agrippa, and then at the end in Rome, where he's 2 years teaching the people in a room that is rented to him, or rented by him. So somewhere around 67, 68 AD is where the book ends. Okay, so let's add a little bit more in here. The Apostle Paul first comes in to mention in chapter 9 when Stephen is being dead. It says that there was a young man there that was holding on to his clothing, to Stephen's clothing at the time. So he's introduced in chapter 9. And then after his conversion, he goes to Damascus for 3 years. And then after that, he goes to the Jerusalem Council. Now, we have to use some of the epistles in order to get the information on there. So Galatians 2, he says, for 14 years, or after 14 years, I received a revelation, and I took it to the elders in Jerusalem, and I met with them privately so that I would not be as one that had run in vain. So he's getting himself, is this true? Is this true what I see, or what the way that I'm interpreting? They agreed, and when they agreed, then on the second missionary journey, then this is the revelation that he's speaking of. Now, if Galatians is talking about this so that after 14 years he received a revelation, this isn't the revelation of Jesus Christ. Christ. He received this revelation within the as soon as he saw him, and then for 3 years. He says, I spoke with no man, I spoke with no one. But the revelation that he's talking about after 14 years where he goes to the Jerusalem Council, if you know the Jerusalem Council, you know it has to be about circumcision. So the book of Acts has to do with this concept of circumcision, not the law of Moses as a whole, and not the revelation of Jesus Christ. So if you're able to put it within this timeline, then you can see kind of what's going on. We'll go a little bit more into that, and then he goes to Athens in the second missionary journey. He's in Athens, and then you hear about Priscilla and Aquila, and then you'll hear eventually about Apollos. This is where you can find all of these. So if you know the highlights, you know where to find the story, even if you don't have the every verse memorized. Okay, and then after the third missionary journey, he runs into the disciples of John, or disciples of John that have been baptized under John's baptism. Here's a question. I'm asking you these questions because I have fun doing this. If the disciples of John that were baptized under the baptism of John were rebaptized by Paul into the baptism of Jesus, didn't John also baptize James and the apostle John, and also Peter, and also Jesus? So if these were rebaptized because John had baptized them before, and then was Peter and James and then the apostle Paul and the rest of the disciples rebaptized also by Jesus or afterwards? Okay, so that's a question that you have to, and you have to look at, you have to understand what is this baptism about, what is it that they're doing. Okay, or when we come into a greater knowledge, do we then go back and redo? Because some of us will teach that if you leave the church and then you come back and then you repent again, is it okay to be rebaptized? Well, the only way you can answer those questions if you have a full understanding of the concept. And you can get these from the beginning of the book, from the Torah, from the first 5 books. You'll have the answer to these. If not, you're going to be arguing with denominations based on 1 or 2 or 3 verses in the New Testament. But I ask these questions to pastors that have been pastoring for 30 or 40 years, and they can't give me an answer. So because it doesn't say it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. But because it didn't happen doesn't mean that you can't question it. So the answer is there somewhere. But that was kind of interesting to me that John had baptized them, and also the majority of the disciples. So were they also rebaptized? Okay, and let's keep going a little bit. And then from here he goes and teaches 2 years at the school of Tyrannus. And then from there, remember, he stops at Troas, and then at Troas he speaks for so long that there's this young man sitting on a window, and he falls out and he dies, and then they pray for him. He revives, and then Paul just keeps on teaching. So this will kind of give you an idea of where to find the information in order to be able to understand the book of Acts. I don't memorize verses or chapters. I try not to. I just want to know where I can find it in case I have a question for it, because I'll always have a Bible, I'll always have an iPad, I can find it quicker. And if I memorize it, what version do I use? Do I use the King James? Do I use the NASB? Do I use the NIV? Or do I use the Young's Literal Translation? Because if they change the words and I memorize it and I think the concept is in the words, no, I want to see what the story says. I want to know where it's at so that I can remind myself of where it's at and exactly the way that it said it. Okay, let's keep going a little bit on this. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the feast that I found in the book of Acts, and you'll also find this in the epistles if you're looking for them. If not, then you believe that they're irrelevant. It starts out at Pentecost. Again, if everything was fulfilled at the cross by Jesus, remember that Jesus died on the day of Pentecost, or actually he died on Passover. Passover is the one feast that is done inside your home. Not at the temple, not at the tabernacle. Passover, he was the lamb on the Passover for each individual home, for each individual family, for each individual. Okay, and so he fulfilled the Passover. But the we're seeing that the feasts are still being observed here. So chapter 2 is Pentecost, and then we're going to get again where James is killed, and Peter is during the feast is taken over, and then taken and thrown into jail, and then it's after the Passover, after the feast of the 11 breads, is when they want to kill him. You remember an angel comes in and takes him out. Okay, so here's another Passover that it's still being observed. You'll notice that all the people are gathered together in a home. Okay, but this is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, not at Passover. Passover is already gone. It's in the days of the feast, so the days following. And they're all gathered together for whatever reason, not at the temple, because you wouldn't do this at the temple. Okay, and then at the very end, chapter 20 to 22, Paul is at Jerusalem for one day, the day of Pentecost. Pentecost is one day. You come in, you give your offering, you give your sheaves, you give your first fruits, and then you leave. Paul is taking a vow, so for some 7 days before that, he's with some men taking a vow, and he pays whatever the temple priests are charging for that, in order for that vow to be completed. Whatever the priest determines, that is what you will pay, is what the Old Testament says. So this isn't something new. I mean, they could have been overcharging, and that's fine, but he's still fulfilling whatever it is that they required. They still, in essence, abide by whatever the rabbis or the priests would say. So from 20 to 22 to Pentecost, and then again the last 8 chapters, the last 6 chapters have to do with him on his way to Rome, testifying. You hear his testimony 1 or 2 or 3 times, and then the last 2 years where he's a free man, but yet under guard in a rented place. And then we find, or it's understood, that somewhere between 65 and 68 he was beheaded. So this is more or less where it would end, and it's believed that Nero ended his reign in 68. So it's under the jurisdiction of Nero in Rome that it is when he dies. Let's take a look at where the Gospels and the rest of epistles fit in to the timeline that we have here. We're going to take a look at the epistles first, the ones that the Apostle Paul would have written, see where they fit within the book of Acts. To me, the book of Acts is the ruler, or all of these books have to fit within this timeline, and where they fit will tell you where what the Apostle Paul was attempting to say. And it makes a very, very big difference. You see the same concept in the Samuel and in the Kings. You put the prophets where the kings are. You find the same thing in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. You will put you see the understanding in the commandments in Exodus when they're first given are going to be different than in Deuteronomy when they're supposed to be applied in the land. There may be a different application because there is no wine that is given in the wilderness. So when they go into the land, there's the wine will then apply. Grain would then apply. The rules, the instructions for the grain offering apply. In the wilderness, they're not harvesting. They're not picking up grain offerings. Whatever they had is what they brought out of Egypt, and then he provides them the manna that they need. So the same way here, if we can see where they fit, we can see in where either before or after a journey, then it may give us some insight into that. So the first one I'm going to look at is going to be the book of Galatians. Again, chapter 2 of Galatians is 14 years after his conversion. He's writing to the Galatians. He's gone to the Jerusalem Council. He's made his debate known about, or his revelation known about the circumcision. He has already told the Galatians this. So he's writing to the Galatians, and he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who has tricked you into going back and teaching you something or putting something back that I told you that wasn't necessary? Okay, so this is why I say the book of Galatians has to do with circumcision. If you go and read it, it talks about the law, the law, the law, the law. But the understanding is this is the law of circumcision, not the law of Moses. Remember, in this timeline, the only thing that exists is the law of Moses. There is no New Testament here. The New Testament is not compiled until 325 225 years later. It doesn't exist. He's barely writing it. So whatever they have is the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So the book of Galatians cannot be speaking against the law of Moses. So we have to look at it within its timeline. I went and looked at Galatians, and everywhere that it said law, I made a note. Is this the law of circumcision? Is this the law of Moses? Is this another law? So the whole frame of the book of Galatians has to do with Abraham and circumcision, by faith and circumcision. Okay. If you don't see that, then you misapply, or to me, the Catholic rabbis that reworked these verses, these epistles. Maybe it said the law of Moses, and they just took it all out, put law. Maybe it said the law. Maybe it said circumcision. They took it out and put in law. So you have to. It's context. You have to know what the context is. So here, because of the Jerusalem Council, one thing is dealt with, and that is circumcision for the Gentiles. The book of Galatians is about circumcision. Okay, then we'll see 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Many scholars will tell you that Thessalonians was one of the first ones that was written, and within 1 or 2 years, they may be right. I just looked at Galatians because of the Jerusalem Council. I did a study on it. Okay, then once he goes as a prisoner to Rome, he's writing to the Romans, to the Ephesians, to the book of Philemon, Colossians, and Philippians. Now, when he's writing to the Romans and he's a prisoner in Rome, why would he tell them, and in chapter 7, unless you know the law of Moses, you're not going to understand this? And in chapter 28, he says, and from the law of Moses, from the prophets, he was expounding the kingdom of God concerning Jesus. Okay. This is the only thing that he has. All he has is a Tanakh, is the Old Testament. So we have to understand this. We're looking at it 2,000 years down the road backwards. And we're saying, we already have the New Testament. We have it in our hands. They didn't. All they had was the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. I don't even believe that they had the Greek Septuagint to deal with. I believe that when Paul wrote to the Romans and to the Corinth, if you read it very carefully, especially the book of Acts, he's in the synagogues teaching. In the synagogues, the only thing that would be taught would be Hebrew. The only thing that would be spoken would be Hebrew. And the Gentiles are there. We want to place him out, starting churches left and right, but he wasn't doing that. If you read the book of Acts, you'll see it very clearly. Let's keep going, and then 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. It's got to be once he's a free man, and under his own house. And then the last part would be the book of Hebrews, and then from here we're going to go to the Gospels. Now, it's pretty welcomed that he would have written the book of Hebrews. Some believe he didn't because it's seems to be written with a different flair. But the only one of the disciples, the apostles, that would have been able to write this would have been, everybody agrees, would have been the Apostle Paul. Now let's take a look at where the Gospels would fit in. This may surprise quite a few of you, but just bear with me. I agree with. I can only agree with what most of the scholars say, but let's take a look, see if we can find some insight in here. The first one would be written, everybody agrees it's going to be Mark. The year, it varies, but I'm thinking it would be somewhere in the Jerusalem Council where it would be vetted by the elders, and somewhere in here it would have been written. Okay, the second one would have been Luke. Now, Luke is written some 15 years later. or so, 16 years later. And then the next one would be Matthew, some probably 25 years later. And then the last one would have been the book of John. So we have Mark, Luke, and Matthew that correlate, or they're called the synoptic gospels. It's believed that Luke and Matthew used Mark as an outline, added a lot of what he said, and then put in their versions of it. And that could be true. So that when John comes along, John sees what is written there and doesn't include a lot of the parables, a lot of the stories, but he adds his own. And John is an eyewitness. To me, if there's a question about which one is right, it would have to be John. John is an eyewitness, and he certifies his letter. He says, I'm telling you, I'm the one that was there. I certify this. And I didn't even give you everything that is there. There are miracles that if I were to write them all, it would cover volumes, that would fill the earth. But the ones that I'm giving you, I certify I saw this. So this is the difference that you have. Some scoffers will say, look at the four of them and then try to get them to contradict each other. I take them as a whole. And one scholar was right. Yes, we create our own gospel when we do that. We get the complete copy of everything that is there. But when you see the difference in timing on all of this, it's impossible for them to have sat in a room and correlated their stories. So four is better. Okay. Then the book of Revelation, to me, was written before 70, before the destruction of the temple. A lot of scholars will say, no, this was around 90, 100 AD. The Apostle John would have been around 90 years old if that would have happened. But I just think everything was done before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple, because after that everybody is dispersed. No one is talking to you. Everybody is dispersed throughout the nations. The book of Acts is going to fit right somewhere around 62 AD. Now, what is interesting about this, and the reason that I agree with some of the scholars, but the reason that I put it there was because of this. Look down and you'll see after Philemon, you'll see Colossians. And the book of Colossians is also in red because there is in chapter 4 of the book of Colossians, there is something noteworthy that you would have to look at. And that is that Paul is writing, is in Rome, and he's got a group of men that are with him, Aristarchus, Mark, and one that is called Jesus. I think his name was Joshua. I think they mistranslated. Jesus is a made-up Greek word from the Greek that is eus, translated from in essence from the Hebrew, but it's EU, so it's Jesus. Where in the Hebrew, Joshua or Yehoshua, is where that term comes from, or Yah is salvation, Yehovah is salvation. Okay, but he's also called Justice for whatever reason. And then verse 12 is Epaphras, and then at the next verse you'll see something interesting. And Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings, and also Demas. So at this time, Luke is sitting down with Paul. And Paul mentions him in the book of Colossians. These guys are with me. But it would seem to me that here is where Luke would sit down with Paul and get all of this valuable information about his life in order to be able to write the book of Acts after he writes the book of Luke. So he's writing to Theophilus and telling him, look, I'm giving you the story. I got it directly from the source. This is why it almost feels like Paul is the one that is writing it. But I mean that makes sense, right? That the timing is almost perfect. So Colossians is like another verification of the fact that Luke would have been the one that would have written this. So here you have it. You have the all of the information in timeline form. So when you read the book of Romans and you take it out and you're saying that Paul is talking against the law, you need to go back and look at this timeline. They don't have anything but the law of Moses, but the prophets, and but the Psalms. So something that you're reading, either somebody took it out or changed it, or you have to look, or you have to know the Old Testament in order to find out what law he's talking about. What instruction? Was it the instruction of the offerings? Was it the instruction of the Levites? Was it the instruction of circumcision? Was it the instruction, of being able to give a sacrifice? What law is he talking about? Or is he talking about the law of the elders, the tradition of the elders, which most of the time is what is there? The tradition of the Pharisees. When he's talking about the Jews, he's talking about the leaders, the elders, the Pharisees, that have put their own law on top. And this is what he's talking about. Circumcision would be works. By works you're not justified, because Abraham was justified. He believed first and then he did the work. So the work didn't justify him. It was his faith, believing, that justified him. You have to understand. You have to look at the beginning of the book but look at it within its timeline. Okay. Otherwise, you're taking away from the people the instruction that they need in order to be able to have access to God, and then you're replacing it with something else. Okay. I hope this bless you.